Max Verstappen has always been the face of Red Bull Racing, the driver around whom the entire team revolves. But suddenly, out of nowhere, Yuki Tsunoda has dropped a revelation that shakes this foundation to its core. He claims Christian Horner personally assured him that in certain situations, he wouldn't be forced to move aside for Max. But does this mean Red Bull no longer sees Verstappen as their golden boy? And if Tsunoda starts holding his own against Max, could we be witnessing a power shift within the team? For years, Red Bull has operated under an unspoken rule. Max Verstappen comes first. Every other driver, whether it was Pierre Gasly, Alex Albon, or even Sergio Perez, was there to support Verstappen's championship pursuits. If they were ahead of him on track, team orders ensured they wouldn't be for long. That's what made Tsunoda's statement so shocking. For the first time in what feels like forever, we're hearing a Red Bull driver openly claim that he won't necessarily have to yield to Max. Now, of course, there's a diplomatic way to interpret this. Maybe Horner was simply trying to give Tsunoda a confidence boost, telling him that if he has the pace, he won't be unfairly held back. That's a nice, clean, team-friendly version of the story. But let's be honest, when has Red Bull ever operated like that? This is a team with a history of rigid hierarchy, a team that has bent over backward to ensure Verstappen's supremacy. And yet, here we have Tsunoda saying, on record, that he was given assurances that he wouldn't be forced to move over. That's not just a throwaway comment. That's a crack in the foundation of Red Bull's power structure. If you're Verstappen, hearing something like this has to raise some alarms. This isn't a backmarker making some wishful thinking claim. This is Tsunoda, the driver Red Bull just handpicked over Liam Lawson, the driver they promoted just 2 races into the season, disrupting their own lineup in the process. They wouldn't have made that move unless they saw something in him, something worth betting on. And if Red Bull is now telling him he'll have the freedom to race on his own terms, does that mean they're slowly preparing for a future where Max isn't the sole priority? There's also the question of why Tsunoda would even bring this up. If Horner gave him a private assurance about team orders, why say it publicly? One possibility is that Tsunoda, knowingly or not, is planting a seed in the media, forcing Red Bull to stand by this promise now that it's out in the open. Because imagine the backlash if, a few races down the line, he's ordered to let Verstappen through despite having the pace. He's essentially put Red Bull in a position where they have to prove they meant what they said. That's a bold move from a driver who, until recently, was fighting just to stay relevant within the Red Bull camp. And then, there's the elephant in the room, Max Verstappen's reaction. Because if Red Bull is making guarantees like this to Tsunoda, where does that leave him? Verstappen has never been one to shy away from expressing his displeasure when things don't go his way. We've seen him furious over strategy calls, annoyed by even the slightest resistance from his teammates, and now he's reportedly liked a social media post questioning Red Bull's decision-making. That's not the action of a driver who feels secure in his status. That's the move of someone who sees the writing on the wall and doesn't like what it says. The bigger question is whether this is just the beginning of a larger shift, because Tsunoda didn't just talk about team orders, he also made it clear that his car setup will be different from Max's. That might not seem like a big deal on the surface, but it could be. It's too early to say for sure, but one thing is clear, this is not the Red Bull we're used to. Whether this is just an attempt to keep Tsunoda motivated or the first sign of a changing power dynamic, Verstappen has every reason to be watching his back. Because if there's one thing history has shown, it's that in Formula One, being the #1 driver is a privilege, not a guarantee. And right now, Max Verstappen might just be realizing that privilege isn't as ironclad as he thought. Red Bull has never been a team that hides its pecking order. It's not like Mercedes during the Hamilton-Rosberg era, where both drivers were given equal machinery and were left to fight it out. It's not even like Ferrari, where internal power struggles have played out in public for years. Red Bull has always been different, ruthless, decisive, and unwavering in its support for Verstappen. And here we are, with Christian Horner reportedly telling Tsunoda that he won't necessarily have to move aside for Max. For Verstappen, this is the kind of message that demands a response. We've seen glimpses of how he reacts when teammates step out of line. Think back to Brazil 2022 when he refused to give Perez his position back, despite the team asking him to do so. That wasn't about points, it was about power. It was Verstappen sending a message that no one, not even his teammate, dictates what he does on track. The same thing happened in 2021 with Perez in Abu Dhabi, when Max was reluctant to even acknowledge Checo's role in helping him win the title. Verstappen is a lone wolf, someone who thrives on knowing that the entire team is behind him, not split between two drivers. The real question is, what does he do next? If he feels that Red Bull is shifting away from its unwavering support, does he start playing politics behind the scenes? Does he put pressure on Helmut Marko and Horner to reaffirm their commitment to him? Or does he take a more aggressive approach and make it clear, both on and off the track, that Red Bull is still his team? There's also the nuclear option. Verstappen is under contract with Red Bull for the long term, but we've seen in F1 that contracts don't mean much if a driver is unhappy. With Audi entering the sport soon, Mercedes potentially needing a new lead driver after Hamilton, and Ferrari always looking for a game changer, could Verstappen start considering his options? It might seem far-fetched, but if Red Bull starts treating Tsunoda as an equal, Verstappen could view it as a betrayal. And when you're a three-time world champion at the peak of your powers, loyalty only goes so far. If he feels like Red Bull is no longer fully behind him, he might just start looking for a team that is. There's another layer to this entire situation, one that Verstappen is undoubtedly aware of. Red Bull's decision to promote Tsunoda came at the cost of Liam Lawson, a driver who many believed had done enough to earn a full-time seat. And if the rumors are true, Verstappen was not happy about it. Let's rewind to how this all unfolded. Lawson had already proven himself as a capable driver, stepping in for Daniel Ricciardo in 2023 and delivering solid performances. He outperformed Tsunoda on multiple occasions, scoring points in Singapore and showing maturity beyond his years. When Ricciardo returned, Lawson was benched but remained in Red Bull's future plans. Everyone assumed that when Red Bull needed a full-time replacement for Perez or Ricciardo, Lawson would be next in line. But then, just 2 races into 2025, Red Bull made a shocking move. They demoted Lawson back to Racing Bulls and promoted Tsunoda to the senior team. The reasoning? Lawson's performances in Melbourne and China were underwhelming. A crash in Melbourne, a lackluster result in China, just 2 races in, and Red Bull pulled the plug. It was the shortest full-time stint any Red Bull driver has ever had. To say this blindsided people would be an understatement. Lawson was seen as the future, someone Red Bull had been carefully grooming, and yet they discarded him almost instantly. That's why Verstappen's reaction to the move is so interesting. There were whispers that he was against Red Bull swapping Lawson out so quickly. The fact that he liked that Instagram post questioning Red Bull's decision-making? It could very well be linked to this situation. The real question is why Verstappen would be so invested in Lawson. Was it just about talent, or was there something deeper? One possibility is that Verstappen saw Lawson as a non-threatening teammate, someone who could be a solid number 2 without challenging his authority. With Perez's decline and Ricciardo's inconsistency, Lawson might have been Verstappen's preferred choice because he wouldn't rock the boat. Tsunoda, on the other hand, is a wild card. He's aggressive, outspoken, and now, with Horner's promise in his back pocket, he might be emboldened to go toe-to-toe with Verstappen on track. If Verstappen preferred Lawson because he was less of a threat, then Red Bull's decision just made his life much more complicated. There's also another angle. Verstappen might feel that if Red Bull is willing to discard Lawson this easily, what does that say about their loyalty overall? If they can drop a promising young driver without a second thought, then maybe the same ruthlessness could be applied to him down the line. Ultimately, this situation is more than just about who drives for Red Bull. It's about power, influence, and control. Because in Formula One, it's not just about being fast. It's about making sure the team stays on your side. And right now, Red Bull seems to be sending a message. The days of Max Verstappen being the unquestioned number one might be coming to an end. For years, Red Bull's design philosophy has been simple. Build a car that maximizes Max Verstappen's strengths. That's not an exaggeration, it's a fact. The RB19 and RB20 were developed around his unique driving style, a sharp front end, high downforce, and a setup that allows for extreme rotation through corners. It's a combination that makes Verstappen nearly untouchable in clean air, but notoriously difficult for teammates to master. Just ask Pierre Gasly, or Alex Albon, or even Sergio Perez, who, despite being an experienced driver, has struggled with the car's unpredictable nature. Red Bull has always been unapologetic about this. They prioritize winning championships, and that means prioritizing the driver most capable of delivering them. But Tsunoda's recent comments suggest something different. He has openly stated that he will be making his own setup choices, ones that could differ significantly from Max's. That's a major shift. Historically, Red Bull's second driver has been expected to adapt to the car, not the other way around. If Tsunoda is allowed to develop his own approach, we could be looking at the first time in years that Red Bull isn't exclusively designing their car around Verstappen's preferences. Why does this matter? Because it changes the team dynamic entirely. If Verstappen and Tsunoda begin diverging in setup philosophies, it could force Red Bull's engineers to balance two different demands instead of focusing solely on Max's needs. If Red Bull is finally moving toward a car that isn't exclusively tailored for Max, it could mean several things. It could be an experiment, a way to see if giving two drivers equal influence can yield better results. Or it could be a sign that Red Bull is preparing for a future where Verstappen isn't their only focal point. Either way, it's a fundamental change in philosophy, and it's happening right in front of us. And if Verstappen starts to feel like the car is no longer optimized for him alone, how does he react? Would he adapt? Or would he see it as another sign that his reign at Red Bull is starting to fade? All of these developments, Tsunoda's promotion, Horner's promise, the shift in car philosophy, point to a bigger question. Is Red Bull setting the stage for a post-Verstappen era? It's an uncomfortable thought for Red Bull fans, but it's not unrealistic. As dominant as Verstappen has been, Red Bull knows they can't rely on one driver forever. Contracts can be broken, drivers can get frustrated, and the team has to think long-term. The biggest sign of this shift is how they've handled their driver lineup. Red Bull has always cycled through junior drivers quickly, but this Tsunoda move feels different. It's not just about replacing an underperforming driver, it's about actively grooming someone to take on more responsibility. If Tsunoda proves he can fight at the front, Red Bull suddenly has leverage. They no longer need to be completely dependent on Verstappen. Then there's the relationship between Verstappen and Red Bull itself. There have been whispers for months that Verstappen's long-term commitment isn't set in stone. Mercedes is still searching for a Hamilton successor. Audi is entering the sport with massive resources. If Verstappen ever feels like Red Bull is shifting away from him, those doors could start looking very tempting. Even if Verstappen stays, Red Bull is clearly changing its approach. For the first time in years, they're showing signs of operating like a team that wants two strong drivers rather than one superstar and a supporting act. That shift, if it continues, could fundamentally alter the team's identity. Could Red Bull become a team where their two drivers fight freely, like Mercedes in the Rosberg era? Could they become more like McLaren, where both drivers are treated equally and allowed to challenge each other? Or is this just a temporary phase, one that will disappear the moment Verstappen asserts his authority again?